I'll see you soon.
Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand. Chapter 15. "Now wait just a goddamn minute," Allie said. "Are you going to stand there and tell me that everything we've just gone through in the past 12 hours doesn't strike you as being weird?" On the opposite side of the hospital waiting room, Ackerman had his back turned to her. His attention was focused more on the candy dispenser that had just eaten his dollar than in answering her questions. That was fine with Arlen. At least it meant the cop wasn't giving him the evil eye every chance he got. "Well, are you Detective Ackerman?" Allie demanded. "'Cause if you are, you're only fooling yourself." Without turning around, Warren grunted. "Am I going to tell you none of this seems weird, Mrs. Gaines? No, I'm not." Now he turned to face her. "But if you're trying to convince me there's some real-life X-Files bullshit going on, and that some great supernatural force has got it in for us because we, ducked out of a fucking elevator last night? Not a chance, sweetheart." "But it wasn't just any elevator, was it?" she shot back. "It was the one we were supposed to be on when it crashed. The one we were supposed to die on." "And so now what?" he asked. "The Grim Reapers trying to make up for, letting us slip through the cracks? Putting everything the way it should be before somebody finds out he filed an incomplete report?" "Well, something was driving that van after Officer Murphy got killed," she countered. "Oh, that's right," he said sarcastically. "Well, according to you, it was Officer Murphy's legs that were doing the driving." "No, I said they were working the pedals." She paused, realizing just how ridiculous that must sound. "Besides, none of him was touching the steering wheel, and that's what's aimed us at the tanker truck." "Uh-huh," Ackerman replied, clearly unconvinced. "And do you think that, death?" she offered. "Whatever. You think, whatever it is you think that might be after us is gonna try again?" "Of course I do," she replied sharply. "Don't you get it? When we stepped off that elevator, we were cheating Death from getting all the souls he was supposed to collect in that accident. And now, he's not going to stop coming after us until he fills that quota." "Cheating Death, huh?" Ackerman said wryly. "Well, we sure picked the right town to do it in, didn't we?" He shook his head in mock sadness. "I think that premonition you had has got you seeing angels and devils now, Mrs. Gaines. Maybe you ought to see if the hospital's got a psych ward with an available rubber room." "Look, Detective, if you need to put it into terms you can feel comfortable with, you can just think of it as," she smiled wickedly, "restoring the cosmic balance." Ackerman grinned and wagged an index finger at her. "Nice wordplay there, Mrs. Gaines, turning my own words against me. But that doesn't change the fact that you're really starting to bug the shit out of me." Arlen's stomach rumbled, but he wasn't sure if that was because he was hungry, or because all these brushes with death he'd been having since yesterday were giving him nervous gas. He'd almost shit himself in the van during the wild ride. Maybe he should hit the john again. He stood up, and Ackerman stopped banging the snack machine to point a warning finger at him. "Hey, where the fuck do you think you're going?" he demanded. Arlen jerked a thumb over his shoulder in the direction of the men's room down the hall. "I gotta go to the can, man." Ackerman pointed to the plastic chair Arlen had just vacated. "Put your ass back in that seat. I'm not letting you out of my sight. You're the only lead I have to finding Diaz." "What?" Arlen couldn't believe what he'd just heard. Hey, it's not like I know the guy, man." "So you say," Ackerman cut in. This asshole is really starting to get on my nerves, Arlen thought. "Yeah, I do say, actually," he replied. "All he did was come into the laundromat and—" He paused, wondering how he could best put this without coming across like a pussy. "And then I had to ask him to leave." Ackerman took one more kick at the base of the machine, but the dispenser didn't seem in the mood to give up anything in return for the dollar it had taken. The detective turned back to face Arlen. There was a condescending grin pulling at the corners of his mouth. "You asked him to leave," he said, the tone of his voice making it clear he thought Arlen was jerking his chain. A big Mexican wrestler type like Diaz. You politely told him to, what, get the hell out of your store? And he just got up and did it without saying a word. Something like that, Arlen said slowly. Uh-huh, Ackerman countered. Nothing like that, actually. Arlen's stomach rumbled again. Yeah, it was definitely nervous gas. From the intensity of its burbling, he figured his ass must be on the verge of exploding. Okay, he conceded. Maybe there was a little misunderstanding between the two of us. He pointed toward the bathroom. Can I go now? Define a little misunderstanding, Ackerman said, ignoring his plea for relief. Arlen sighed. There wasn't any other way around it. He had to tell him. Well, he figured maybe if he spilled his guts, oh, there was a poor choice of words, the goddamn cop would finally let him go take his shit before it was too late. Okay, he said. The guy came in around 6, all hyper because there was a patrol car rolling by. I could tell right away he was trying to avoid them. You could tell how, Ackerman said. Arlen scratched the back of his ear for a couple of moments, trying to find a way to describe what he'd seen. Then he hit upon it. You ever seen someone busted, happy to see you, Detective? Ackerman shook his head. No. Then you know the look they get when they see you coming, he replied. That's the look Diaz had on his face, man. From the slow nod Ackerman gave, it was clear the detective understood what he meant. He paused, not wanting to go any further with his story. But there was no sense in holding anything back. Time to put all the cards on the table, right? I knew the guy had to be in some major trouble, so I told him he had to leave. That's when he started hitting me. That seemed to get Ackerman's interest. And did you hit back? Arlen smiled nervously. No, I'm really not the physical type. Surprise. No, not a surprise, Ackerman commented sarcastically. So what kept him from twisting your spine into a pretzel? One of the customers pointed out there was a security camera taping our, misunderstanding. He ran out after that, man. Ackerman's eyes narrowed. So he assaults you. You get it on tape. I'm not sure there was any tape in the machine, Arlen mumbled. You have witnesses, the detective continued. One of them really doesn't understand English, Arlen said sheepishly. And you didn't call the police to report it, Ackerman said through gritted teeth. At all? Agitated, he ran a hand through his hair. Jesus Christ, we could have picked him up last night if you just said something. He wheeled around to deliver a savage kick to the candy machine. Shit! A Snickers bar popped off one of the corkscrew wire holders and tumbled into the pickup slot. He said he was going to come back and kill me if I called the cops, man, Arlen explained. He's wanted for questioning and a murder, you asshole, Ackerman snapped. You could have helped us put him away if you just picked up the goddamn phone. He could be across the state border by now, fucknut. I'm sorry, Arlen replied. Shit, how was I supposed to know that? You couldn't have, said a female voice. They both turned to face Allie. She, in turn, gestured with her thumb to an African-American woman in a white medical coat standing next to her. The woman was in her mid-20s with long, frizzy hair tied back in a ponytail, and a pair of really attractive legs that Arlen focused on right away. A nice package all around, he thought, even with the lab coat. Too bad she's not Asian. He remembered her name was Dr. Coburn, and she was the emergency room head they'd met when they arrived at Valley Hospital Medical Center an hour ago. Coburn had made sure the blood-soaked arrivals were cleaned up and checked out and provided with temporary clothing. That meant Arlen and his two waiting room companions wound up sitting around in green surgical scrubs, like they were extras on a medical TV show or something, while Ackerman's girlfriend, Allie's husband, and Montoya were being attended to. Luckily for the group and Detective Montoya, it was a trip that hadn't taken very long, since the hospital was located on Shadow Lane just a few blocks from where the van came to rest on Charleston Boulevard. The two patrol cars that had been a part of the motorcade had shown up seconds after Allie had found the brake and, More cops and a couple of ambulances had arrived not long after that. Strangely enough, Arlen and the others had no trouble getting out of their seatbelts once the excitement had ended. That FBI agent, Hotz, and his silent stooge had dropped by for a while. He'd been pretty sure that Allie's mysterious accomplices had tried to spring her or kill her before she could tell him anything useful. But Ackerman and the cops who'd witnessed the van's crazy run down the strip had made it clear that was not the case. The thing was, nobody could come up with a plausible explanation for what exactly had happened. Allie had insisted the van had been driving itself, or at least something had been controlling it, but that had sounded almost as batshit as her story about the premonition. Except, of course, that one had actually panned out. So, Arlen thought, maybe her story about the van wasn't as wild as it seemed. With all the weird shit going on, it probably wouldn't surprise him to find out that Satan himself had been behind the wheel. At least it would explain the nagging feeling he was starting to get that somebody or something was trying to kill them. "And I'd appreciate it if you gentlemen would continue this discussion in a lower tone of voice," Coburn was saying as Arlen focused on her again. "Or take it outside. This is a hospital, not Fight Club." Arlen mumbled an apology, while Ackerman offered a gruff, "Sorry, Doctor." She turned to the cop. "You're Detective Ackerman, right?" He nodded, but there was a worried look that now crept into his eyes. "Shauna?" "She's doing okay," Coburn assured him. "More shaken up than injured. The blood on her was Officer Murphy's." He smiled. "Well, thank Christ for that." The smile suddenly faltered. Apparently the jackass had realized what his remark must sound like. "I mean, thank Christ she's okay, not about—" "I know what you mean, Detective," Coburn replied. "I've given her a mild sedative to relax her a little. From what she's told me, she hasn't exactly been having the best couple of days." He grunted. "Yeah, I guess you could say that," he replied sarcastically. "We're also running an HIV test on her," the doctor continued. The wry smile looked like it had been smashed off Ackerman's face. What's that for?" he asked. There was a nervous tone in his voice. "I mean, I know what it's for, but why are you doing one on Shauna?" "We just want to make sure she's not running any risk of infection," Coburn explained. "Mrs. Ingalls told me the blood got in her mouth and nostrils. She requested that we perform the test, sir." "Oh." Just for a moment there was a look of relief that flickered through his facial muscles, like he'd just dodged a bullet. Or like maybe now he didn't have a reason to think his girlfriend had been cheating on him. "And how long will it take to find out one way or the other?" "A few days," Coburn replied. "But I tried to explain to her that the results might be inconclusive. It normally takes anywhere between 3 and 6 months for the antibodies to show up in a test. She insisted on it anyway." 6 months, huh? Ackerman gestured at himself and his fellow survivors. "Well, we all got Murphy's blood on us, Doctor." "Yes, I know," she said, "and all of you might want to consider having us run the same test, just to be on the safe side." Allie nodded, her eyes wide, her bottom lip trembling a little. The kid looked scared. Well, hell, Arlen thought. Who could blame her? Next to Montoya, she'd been the one closest to that cop when he got cut in half and started spraying his juices all around. And she'd been the one swimming around in his intestines on the floor of the van. If anybody was going to get infected with something real nasty from Murphy's blood, it was probably going to be her. Without realizing it, he took a step back, putting a little more distance between them. Allie, however, caught the movement and looked at him like he'd just shot her dog. Arlen shifted his attention to staring at a small spot on the waiting room carpet. "And how's my partner, Doctor?" Ackerman then said. Arlen glanced up to see Coburn consult her clipboard. "Detective Montoya suffered a concussion and lacerations around the head and chest. If that traffic light had swung just a few inches more to the right, she would have suffered the same fate as Officer Murphy." Ackerman heaved a huge sigh of relief. "Will she be able to leave? I know her husband and kids are on their way over." Coburn shook her head. "Not for a few days. I I want to keep her for observation just to make sure there isn't any brain damage."
"Is that a possibility, Doctor?"
Arlen was surprised. For a tough guy, Ackerman looked like he might be on the verge of tears. "There's always a possibility, Detective," the doctor replied calmly. "But I've talked to Detective Montoya, and she seems alert and in full control of her faculties. I wouldn't worry if I were you. It's really just a precaution." He nodded.
"Okay, thank you." He looked like a weight had suddenly lifted from his shoulders. Geez, Arlen wondered. If the guy is that worried about his partner, maybe they got a little thing going on the side that his girlfriend isn't privy to. He hadn't seen much of Montoya's figure under that jacket and pants she wore while he was being questioned. But she sure filled out her blouse pretty damn well. Arlen shook his head. It just wasn't fair. A showgirl type on one side, and a hot-looking lady cop on the other. Shit, some guys really did get all the goddamn luck.
"And in case you're wondering, Detective," Coburn said, "those 2 state troopers who'd been riding alongside your van are in surgery right now. The surgeons are doing the very best they can, but—"
Ackerman gritted his teeth and exhaled sharply. "Damn. What are their chances?"
Coburn paused. "To be honest, it doesn't look good. One is suffering from massive head trauma, a broken collarbone and a punctured lung. The other has a fractured pelvis, 2 broken legs, and there's the possibility his spine was severed at the base. The doctors may be able to save them, but they'll never be the same men they were."
The detective frowned. "Shit," was his only comment.
"And my husband, Dr. Coburn?" Allie asked hesitantly.
That was odd, Arlen thought. It was almost like she wasn't used to saying the word. Didn't the 2 of them just get married? He shrugged. Newlyweds. Who can figure them out anyway? Coburn smiled and placed a consoling hand on Allie's shoulder.
"Your husband got a nasty cut on his forehead, Mrs. Gaines, but you'll be able to take him home today. We stitched him up and gave him a tetanus shot. Heaven knows how much bird shit and rust was caked on that light. And I'll prescribe something for the pain. The stitches should dissolve in a few days, but make sure he keeps the area clean so it doesn't get infected."
Allie smiled.
"Sure, and thank you, Doctor." "You can thank me by not showing up in my ER again looking like you just fought a losing war," Coburn replied. "I'd prefer not having to see that many people stagger in here drenched in blood for a good long while, if it's all the same to you."
"We'll try to keep that in mind, Doctor," Ackerman said good-naturedly. Coburn stared silently at each of them in turn, then looked to the detective.
"You're the people from the tower, aren't you?" "Yeah, I saw your pictures on the news."
It was Allie who answered.
Yeah, that's us,"
she said quietly, then smiled nervously.
"We kind of have a knack for getting into trouble, huh?" "I'd consider that the understatement of the century," the doctor replied. "I'll drop by again when Mr. Gaines and Mrs. Ingalls are ready to be released."
She turned to go, stopped, turned back to Ackerman.
"Oh, wait."
She fished around in her coat pockets and came up with a scrap of paper which she handed to the detective.
"Miss Ingalls couldn't find her cell phone, so she asked if you could call her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Barker, and ask her how—"
She paused and closed her eyes for a moment.
"A-Rod and Jolly—"
"Her cats," Ackerman explained with a smile.
"are doing," she continued. "Apparently she's cat-sitting until Miss Ingalls gets back." She pointed to the paper. "That's Mrs. Barker's number. Miss Ingalls just wants to make sure they're okay."
"Sure thing, Doctor," he replied. "You can tell her I'll get right on it."
"I will," Coburn said. She nodded at the group. "Nice to meet y'all."
"Thanks, Doc," Arlen chimed in. "And it was nice meeting you." He turned on his megawatt smile, hopefully guaranteed to charm the nylon stockings right off those pretty legs of hers. The light bulb apparently needed replacing, and the charm an upgrade, because all Coburn did was stare at him coolly, then turn on her heel and walk off. Arlen wasn't too surprised by her reaction. She sure had a nice walk, though. "Wow," Ackerman said in mock astonishment. "You're a regular lady killer, Plug. You know that?" "Oh, leave him alone," Allie replied. "Why do you have to keep picking on him, huh? He's gone through as much hell as the rest of us. There's no reason to keep kicking his ass just because he didn't do your job for you." "What?" Ackerman said angrily. He took a menacing step toward Allie, and she backed up a step, bumping against one of the waiting room chairs. She lost her balance and sat down heavily in the molded plastic seat. "What do you think I was doing all day yesterday, jacking off in the squad room? No, I was looking for Diaz. And if somebody had seen fit to drop a dime on the son of a bitch..." He stared daggers at Arlen before turning back to her. "He'd be sitting in an interview room right about now giving us a goddamn statement. But because that didn't happen, he's still loose somewhere on the streets, and I haven't got a fucking clue where to find him. For all I know, he's across the border in Barstow having a beer and laughing his ass off over how he gave Las Vegas PD the slip." He leaned forward and down to put his face on the same level as hers. "A potential child killer, Mrs. Gaines," he said. "And I lost him because somebody made the choice to sit on vital information rather than step up and act like a man." He didn't bother to look in Arlen's direction this time. "Now, do you see why I might be inclined to act a little disrespectfully to our Mr. Plug, Mrs. Gaines?" Allie nodded. "I guess so," she said quietly. "Yeah." The look she gave Arlen spoke volumes. Anger, disgust, sorrow, and pity. Pity for a pathetic loser who valued his own life over that of a child. But how was he supposed to have known about the kid, huh? How the fuck was he supposed to know? And now that he did, it was tearing him up inside. All right, maybe he should have fought the guy, but that would have only gotten him killed. Maybe he should have called the cops right off the bat, but who's to say they would have caught him anyway? Or maybe he just never should have gone to that goddamn restaurant last night. Then he wouldn't be in all this fucking trouble, and he could have continued to live his uneventful gambling loss-filled life in peaceful ignorance. Without killer elevators trying to crash with him inside, without driverless vans trying to smear him across the roadway, and without some fucking cop treating him like shit because he'd been looking out for his own safety. God damn it! Why did they have to look at him like he was some kind of fucking monster? I didn't know," was all he could mutter. I'm sorry, man, but I just didn't know, all right?" But the only answer he received was from his nervous stomach as it bubbled and roiled. With a heavy heart, Arlen trudged down the hall toward the men's room, trying to ignore the burning sensation he felt between his shoulder blades from the hateful glares that were focused on him. Chapter 16. "Well, it's not the presidential suite," Tom said, "but I guess it's going to have to do." Not that he and Allie had much of a choice about it, he thought as he stepped into the motel room and dropped their suitcases and bags on the floor. Having been bumped out of Merlin's Tower while the building was undergoing its safety inspection, and with the more prominent hotels along the strip booked solid, about the best accommodation the newlyweds could be offered by the city of Las Vegas was a less than stately one-room suite at a motor lodge on Paradise Road. It was a take-it-or-leave-it kind of proposition as it was explained to them by Special Agent Hotz, the only other option given them being a choice of cots in a storeroom in the basement of the Federal Building back on Bridger Avenue. But it wasn't as though the Budget's Friend Inn was a terrible place in which to spend the next few days. It just wasn't as grand as the one in which they'd spent the past couple of nights. The room, at least at first glance, looked fairly clean. The air conditioner built into the front wall near the base of the door hummed quietly, instead of rattled with the clash of worn-out parts, and the bed didn't look like it would collapse when they both got on it. There was a color TV bolted onto a swivel base that was set into a corner of the room, near the ceiling, like the kinds you would see in hospitals, and below that a dresser with 2 sets of drawers, a small lamp, and a remote control for the TV stood on top of it. Near the left side of the bed was a small desk, the majority of its surface taken up by another lamp, a clock radio, and a plastic ice bucket. The bathroom was on the far side of the room. He'd been checking it out soon enough, and on the walk up to his second-floor suite, he'd spotted an ice machine, a snack machine, and a soda dispenser. So it wasn't as though there were no places in the immediate vicinity from which to pick up food. If your eating habits mirrored those of a sugar-addicted 6-year-old, that is. "Oh," he heard Allie say from behind him. He turned to find her still standing in the doorway, her head slowly moving side to side as she looked around in mild shock. "So, what do you think?" he asked sarcastically. "Cozy, huh?" The left corner of her upper lip curled slightly in disgust. "Yeah," she said slowly. "Real cozy. Don't know how I could have missed this one in the vacation package deals." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders and gently led her into the room. "Well, just keep in mind that places like this aren't supposed to be that, like the kind you hang out in. They're where you dump your shit so you can go hit the casinos. You leave in the morning, you crash here at night." He gave her a reassuring squeeze. "Hey, it's not like we're under house arrest. We can come and go as we please." "Yeah," she replied. "We're just not allowed to go home." "So?" he said, trying to sound encouraging. "There's still plenty of stuff to do while the FBI susses out what caused that accident. Besides, it's not like we really needed to drive out to Barstow." "You're only saying that because now we're even closer to your Star Trek thing," she said, putting on a cute-as-hell pout. "So at least you're happy." Tom tried to act like her keen observation meant nothing to him, even though the Hilton was just a few blocks away. "Yeah? I hadn't noticed." But knowing Allie, she no doubt knew he was full of shit. He shrugged. "Anyway, we should probably keep a low profile until this blows over." Of course, as they both realized, that might be impossible to do. After he and Allie had been discharged from the hospital, they'd called their families to let them know they were okay. That's when his mother told him the strip mall disaster — where the fuck did reporters come up with shit like that? — was international news, and their faces and names were probably printed in every paper in the country. Their pictures had been shown so often on news reports every hour they were practically TV stars. And it didn't stop there. When the group had arrived at the tower to claim their belongings, their replacement van had been swarmed by the press, and even some of the other hotel guests as well. Everybody had a question, and everybody was demanding an answer. And Tom had started to think they might have to fight their way into the underground garage. The need never arose, though, because the cops swooped in to clear a path. And once the van got inside, the group split up. He and Allie headed for their room to pack. Ackerman and his girlfriend went off to see her bosses at the magic show. Tom and Allie had been meaning to check out, by the way. And as for Plug, well, he just wandered away to get his car. Ackerman had given him a stern warning about seeing him later, whatever that meant, and Allie had looked away when Plug tried to say goodbye to her. Tom had felt sorry for the guy. He looked crushed. Well, he thought, at least I had the decency to shake his hand. After all, we're all in the same boat with this elevator thing, aren't we? "So, what do you want to do now?" Allie asked. Tom flashed a devilish smile. "Well, there's a bed currently not being used, in case you hadn't noticed." She stuck out the tip of her tongue and made a face. "Ew! You know what they say about motel beds, don't you?" He shook his head. "Uh-uh." "You sleep on a motel bed, you're sleeping with everybody who's ever fucked on it." "Oh, really?" He thought about it for a couple of seconds. Not exactly the sort of comment that opened the door to foreplay, but... "Is that a problem for you?" "Nope," she said with a shrug and smiled. "Just thought I'd mention it." "Thanks," he mumbled sarcastically. Allie sighed and closed the door. Then she reached down and snatched one of her bags off the floor. "I need a shower and a change of clothes," she commented, and gestured to the surgical scrubs they were both still wearing. "You do too." Back at the tower, all she'd wanted to do was pack and get the fuck out of the building as fast as possible. And with the service elevator the only one still in use, the remaining 2 outside cars having been shut down until further notice, there was a bottleneck on every floor. with lines of people wanting to take it down to the lobby. So as Allie had put it, if that meant she and Tom had to stay dressed up like a couple of medical students for a little while longer, that was fine with her, so long as they were ultimately able to put some distance between themselves and that tower. Well, the tower was about 2 miles behind them, so cleaning up and putting on some fresh clothes sounded like a good idea. It sounded even better, Tom figured, if maybe they did it together. A regular couples kind of activity. As she headed toward the bathroom, he just smiled and admired the view. Even in baggy green pants, there was no hiding that cute little wiggle her ass made when she walked. "You gonna need some help in there?" he asked playfully. "You know how much trouble you have with those hard-to-reach places." She stopped at the door and stood there for a moment with her back to him. When she turned around, he was stunned to see her eyes tearing up. For some reason, she looked scared. "Oh, Tom, I don't know," she said hesitantly. "I mean, with everything that's happened and the tests we took at the hospital." So that was it, the AIDS test. Yeah, that had scared the shit out of him, too, when that Dr. Coburn had brought it up. But it had made sense to take it, especially with all the blood that had been flying around the van, and Tom with the big gash on his forehead. Until the 5 of them got the results in a few days, it was going to be Tension City all around. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around his wife. "Hey, don't worry about it," he assured her. "The machine needed a little downtime anyway, right? That's what you said last night." Her laugh was muffled by his shirt. "I'm still not putting on the tinfoil," she said. Tom sighed. "You are a harsh mistress." She nudged him in the stomach with her fist. "I'll remember you said that next time I go shopping for a whip." His eyebrows rose. "I didn't even know there was a first time," he commented. She looked up and smiled. "Well, a girl's got to have her secrets. I'm sure you have a few I don't know about." She winked. "This marriage thing's going to be quite the learning experience, huh?" "For you and me both," he agreed, and kissed the tip of her nose. Then he smiled slyly. "So, what do you want to do about the bed?" Her smile widened. "Why don't you go try it out?" That took him by surprise. "What, alone?" Her right hand slid along his crotch, and little Tom came wide awake. "That's why God gave you 2 hands and imagination, right?" she said. "You could always help me out, you know," he suggested. "I wouldn't object." She gave him a little slap on the balls. He winced. "You'll be fine," she whispered, and before he could object, she stepped into the bathroom and closed the door. "Yeah," he muttered, "but it won't be the same thing." On the other side of the door, Allie stood smiling for a couple of seconds. It might be a little too early to tell, but it looked like things might be starting to get back to normal. Tom wanted sex, but she controlled the situation. It looked like married life was starting to agree with her. She shrugged out of the hospital clothes and tossed them in a corner of the bathroom. As baggy and unattractive and eye-woundingly green as the scrubs were, they'd proved useful in at least one regard. They'd kept everyone from knowing she went commando when it came to undergarments. God only knew how Tom might have reacted if he'd found out. He might have popped a major boner on the ride to the tower. Well, maybe that would be another of those secrets she'd mentioned to him that she'd be willing to share some other time. She stepped over to the shower. Given the small size of the room, there wasn't space enough for a bathtub, so the shower was of the glass cabinet variety, its walls rising full length from floor to ceiling. She opened its door and turned on the faucets, tweaking the hot and cold until the temperature of the water was just how she liked it. As steam began building, she closed the door and moved back to the bag she'd brought in, from which she selected jeans, a black t-shirt, and a pair of black ankle socks. The clothes were placed on the toilet tank. Then she returned to the bag to retrieve her makeup kit, brushes, and travel blow dryer, which went on the sink counter. "You want some takeout?" Tom called from outside. "There's a list of restaurants here that says there's a Chinese place around the corner." "Sure," she yelled back. "Get me the General Tso chicken, if they have it, and some spring rolls." "Okay, be back in a few." She heard the door open and close. Yeah, she thought, some spicy Chinese takeout sounded good right about now. She hadn't had much to eat since she'd puked out her guts in the van, and just the mere mention of food had set her stomach rumbling. Another dip into the bag, and she came up with bottles of apple-scented body wash and herbal essence shampoo. With one in each hand, she slid open the glass door and stepped under the water. She hadn't been in the shower more than 2 minutes when it tried to kill her. The vat of oil bubbled and hissed as the woman reached in with a pair of long-handled tongs to pull out a chicken wing. The skin was dark brown and crispy, a little too crispy for Tom's liking. Deep-fried wings from a Chinese takeout wasn't his favorite kind of chicken, but the restaurant guide back at the motel hadn't indicated any KFC franchises in the immediate vicinity. He mentally shrugged. Sometimes you just had to make do with what's available, right? The woman behind the counter, who looked like she could be anywhere from 40 to 60, it was hard to judge, dropped the wing and 2 others in a wax paper bag and stapled the top. Then told Tom the rest of his order would be ready in 1 minute. Tom nodded pleasantly, then turned around to get a better look at the goings-on Desert Inn Road. It was a little difficult to get a clear view. A cloud of pork-scented smoke swirled around the restaurant in the thick air, pushed along by 2 aging ceiling fans, and the windows were caked with a thick layer of grease. When this place might have last been visited by a health inspector was a question Tom didn't even want to consider. In all likelihood, it had been when the first President Bush was in office. But that was all right with Tom. As he'd often discovered, it was the most questionable-looking eateries that served the best food and the largest portions. Probably had more to do with focusing on the dishes they made and keeping the customers happy, rather than with worrying about scraping the built-up layers of grease and food bits that surrounded the oversized burners on the stoves. And if that held true for this takeout joint, which Tom felt strongly it did, then Allie better be ready for some really spicy chicken. Spices guaranteed to burn the roof off of her mouth. Protecting the roof of her mouth from burns was the last thing Allie was thinking about. She was more concerned with keeping her skin from boiling right off the bone under the torrent of scalding hot water that was pouring out of the shower head. For the 10th time she tried to open the glass door, and for the 10th time it refused to slide back along its track. It was as though the door was stuck, or maybe something on the other side was holding it closed. She banged on the glass. "Tom!" she screamed. "Tom, get in here, please! I can't shut off the water!" No answer. He was probably still out buying the Chinese food. She grabbed the hot water faucet, noticing just how red the skin of her hands was in the boiling cloud of steam, and tried turning it all the way to the left, surely to shut it off. Like the door, however, it resisted her efforts. Then she tried the cold water faucet. That turned easily, and to her surprise the jet of burning water began to cool. She smiled and looked up at the shower head as the water slowed to a trickle. Allie let out a short laugh. "You'll have to do better than that to kill me, fucker." And then, in a burst of pressure like that of a fire hose nozzle being opened, the shower head rocketed off the pipe and slammed into Allie's right temple. Dazed, she stumbled back as water poured out of the open pipe. Her left heel came down on the bottle of body wash. The plastic container slipped out from under her foot, and she lost her balance. With a loud thump, the back of her head bounced off the tiled wall behind her. Blue eyes rolled back in their sockets as she lost consciousness and slid bonelessly to the floor. The water continued to flow out from the broken pipe, first pulling around Allie's prone body, then rising. The Chinese woman told Tom his food was ready. "Terrific," Tom said, and pulled out his wallet to pay. She said it was $13.45, and he handed her a $20 bill. As she rang up the order on the cash register, a supermarket-style relic covered with plastic sheeting to protect it from the grease that seemed to get on everything in the restaurant, she glanced back at him. "You doctor?" "Huh?" Tom said. Then he looked down at his garb. He was still wearing the green surgical scrubs. He smiled. "No, I just borrowed these." She nodded, although it wasn't entirely clear she'd understood his comment. "You look like the doctor on the TV." "Oh," he said pleasantly. "Well, thanks." She nodded again and handed him his change. Tom grabbed the bag of food and headed out the door with a final wave to the woman. As he walked down the street, he held the bag up under his nose and took a deep breath. His nostrils filled with the aroma of chicken and pork and deep-fried grease, guaranteed to clog his arteries. Not the kind of thing a real physician would recommend to his patients. But then Tom Gaines wasn't a real doctor. He just played one, like the actors on TV. "Me, a doctor?" he thought with a grin, remembering the Chinese woman's comment about how he looked like one. "Won't that shock the hell out of Allie when I see her?" It was the shock of finding herself underwater that brought Allie to full awareness. She screamed, unleashing a torrent of air bubbles, and then the water tried to force its way into her lungs. She closed her mouth and put a hand to her throat. "Like that's gonna do any good," the tiny voice called out from the back of her mind. She then looked around. The stall had filled almost to the top, and more was still flowing in. A dark shape floating near her head caught her attention, and she turned to find the herbal essence bottle bobbing up and down in the makeshift water tank. Grabbing the door handle, Allie pulled with all her might, but it wouldn't open. She banged on the glass, but the impact sounded so muffled she couldn't be sure Tom would hear it, even if he were standing right by the bathroom door. It was difficult to hold her breath any longer. Every muscle in her throat was urging her to open her mouth and inhale. Kicking her legs, she pushed off the floor and shot up to the top of the stall. Her nose and mouth broke the surface. There was about 4 or 5 inches of open space between the rising water and the ceiling. She managed to suck in a big, hungry breath before her hand slipped on one of the walls and she went under. She popped back up immediately, but there was less air available as the water continued its upward crawl. Allie tried to raise her head higher and banged her nose on the white wallpapered ceiling. The bump submerged her again. One last try. Her lips scraped along the dusty mold-spotted ceiling as she drew in the last remaining oxygen in the death chamber. Drowning in some fleabag motel shower, she thought. This is such a fucking stupid way to die. And then she went down for the 3rd time. Tom knew something was wrong the second he saw the water seeping out from under the bathroom door. "Hey, Allie, you better turn off the water in there. You're getting the rug out here all wet," he called out as he set the bags of Chinese food on the dresser. When he received no answer, he said, "Allie, you okay in there?" Still no answer, and now he quickly moved to the door. It was locked. He knocked loudly on the painted wood. "Allie, what's going on?" Nothing. Now he was really getting worried, and he started pushing the door. When that produced no results, he turned to slamming his shoulder against it. Finally, he took a step back, gritted his teeth, and lashed out with his right foot. The wood around the knob plate split, and he kicked it again. This time the wood broke and the door swung open. Tom stepped into the bathroom, his eyes following the trail of water across the floor and back to its source. "Jesus Christ!" he screamed. Okay, Slashaholics, what a place to stop, right? That has been chapters 15 and 16 of Final Destination Dead Man's Hand. You know, I gotta say, this book is really kind of reminding me of Dreamspawn. It's one of the Freddy books where it took 200 pages to get to Freddy, but once it got to Freddy, it was a pretty good book. This one is pretty good, except there's a couple things about the author that makes me think he's got partially a mind of a 12-year-old. But other than that, and apparently he's got some problems with certain types of people, it seems like. But besides that, the story's not bad. This was a very action-packed end of the upload, and I cannot wait to get back on here and find out how this situation gets resolved, as I'm sure you are wondering as well, because we did kind of leave on a cliffhanger tonight. So guys, let me know in the comments section what you think of the book so far, what you thought of tonight's upload, and especially tonight's cliffhanger. And I'll be back very soon with more of this book. Before I go, tonight's upload was brought to you by our patrons over on the Patreon page, Kathleen McClear, Carl Eakin, Sean Campbell, and Cecilia Spears. Thank you so much, guys, for helping keeping this channel running, and hope you're patrons for a long time to come. This channel is going to keep growing, and if anybody else would like to sponsor the channel to help ensure its growth, then please check out the link in the description below. And for as little as $5 a month, you can help keep this channel going and get some pretty awesome rewards for doing so. Alright guys, until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
I'll see you soon.